Liber Linteus, a book inside a corpse. When we say the word book, our imagination dutifully conjures heavy leather folios with yellowed parchment pages or fragile papyrus scrolls. Yet reality sometimes presents artifacts whose very physical nature delivers an aesthetic shock and makes us question what we are seeing. In the quiet halls of the Archaeological Museum in Zagreb rests an object known to scholars as the Liber Linteus, or linen book, the only surviving literary work whose text was written not on paper, wood, or stone, but on long strips of linen cloth. But the most astonishing and unsettling aspect lies not in the material itself, but in the macabre fate that befell the text. Unknown craftsmen of the distant past coldly cut the priceless manuscript into narrow bands to use them as utilitarian burial wrappings for the body of a deceased Egyptian woman, forever binding secret knowledge to the dark cult of death. For centuries, this mummy, brought to Europe in the mid-19th century as an exotic souvenir, attracted little academic attention until scholars carefully studying the embalming process noticed strange symbols on the darkened fabric that bore no resemblance to traditional Egyptian hieroglyphs. When the wrappings were delicately removed, cleaned, flattened, and reassembled into a single composition, stunned researchers found themselves facing a complete book composed of 12 columns of text written in the Etruscan language, the language of the great and mysterious people who dominated the Italian peninsula before the rise of Rome, only to be erased by the relentless wheel of history. The paradox of this manuscript is that modern linguistics, capable of deciphering the most complex Sumerian cuneiform tablets and the intricate glyphs of the Maya civilization, stands utterly powerless before the smooth lines of the linen book, because Etruscan, as a language isolate, has no reliably known relatives among the world's language families. We know their alphabet in detail, once borrowed from the ancient Greeks, and any history student can read the words aloud with relative ease, reproducing the phonetic sounds of a dead language. Yet the act resembles chanting spells in an unknown tongue. We hear the sounds, but we confront a vast emptiness of meaning. Of the approximately 1,200 surviving words, researchers have managed to identify with reasonable certainty only a small portion, consisting mainly of the names of forgotten deities and scattered calendar dates, suggesting that the text is ritual in nature, describing sacred ceremonies whose true essence remains forever concealed behind an impenetrable veil of time. This artifact represents a genuine chronological and cultural anomaly, where the sacred writing of one vanished European civilization survived for millennia solely because it was repurposed as burial waste in the ritual practices of another culture that had no idea of the value of what it used to wrap its dead. We are condemned to stare endlessly at these ancient lines, knowing that before us lies a detailed manual for communicating with gods, the key to which was irretrievably lost the very moment the last person who spoke Etruscan breathed their final breath. The Copper Scroll, a mocking map with no landmarks. In the mid-20th century, when Bedouin shepherds wandering among the scorching cliffs of the Judean desert accidentally stumbled upon the famous Qumran caves, the scientific world was shaken by the magnitude of the discovery. For inside shattered clay jars lay hundreds of priceless Dead Sea Scrolls that forever altered our understanding of Middle Eastern history. Yet among the many fragile parchment and leather fragments covered in faded lines of biblical prophecy, archaeologists uncovered a single artifact whose physical nature completely defied the logic of ancient manuscripts and boldly challenged the very concept of a scroll. This object, designated by the dry academic code 3Q15, was made not of animal skin or woven papyrus, but of 3 sheets of pure copper fastened together, into which an unknown, yet clearly hurried scribe had hammered each letter of his secret message with tremendous physical effort. By the time of its discovery, the metal, after spending nearly 2,000 years sealed in a damp stone cavity, had oxidized so severely and become so dangerously brittle that any attempt, even the most careful, to simply unroll the copper cylinder would have instantly reduced it to a pile of useless green dust. To rescue the hidden secret, engineers were forced to take an unprecedented step in the history of archaeology, constructing a miniature circular saw with which they carefully cut the rigid scroll into 23 curved strips, revealing a text that stunned not only academic historians, but also professional treasure hunters. When leading experts in ancient Hebrew finally translated the engraved, time-distorted lines, they realized with astonishment that what lay before them was not a religious treatise, not a philosophical meditation on mortality, and not a strict monastic code, but a meticulous, dry, and astonishingly precise inventory list. The copper scroll turned out to be a literal, tangible treasure map, describing 64 secret hiding places where, in the face of the inevitable and brutal Roman invasion, the immense wealth of the Jerusalem temple had been hastily buried, with a combined weight, according to the most conservative modern estimates, exceeding an incredible 60 tons of gold and silver. It would seem that the greatest mystery had been solved, and that modern seekers needed only to take metal detectors and follow the coordinates to unearth the largest treasure in human history. Yet here, the cruel irony of time intervenes. The ancient compiler of the list, obsessed with secrecy, used landmarks obvious only to his contemporaries. He writes that gold is buried in the large cistern in the courtyard of the peristyle, hidden in the drain beneath the eastern wall, or placed in the cave near the old bath. Today, after 2,000 years of continuous wars, destruction, and architectural transformations that have erased the entire ancient landscape of Jerusalem, those walls, drains, and courtyards exist only as invisible ghosts of the past, turning the most expensive map in history into a mocking quest that is physically impossible to complete, because the very location where the prize was buried has been permanently deleted from the servers of our reality. The Grand Grimoire, a legal contract with hell. When studying classic medieval treatises devoted to the mystical arts, a curious researcher typically encounters endless rows of pious prayers, elaborate systems of angelic protection, and grueling periods of prolonged fasting designed to shield the fragile human psyche from corrupting infernal influence. Yet the artifact known in occult circles as the Grand Grimoire, or the Red Dragon, completely dismantles this protective paradigm. This dark folio, whose origins are shrouded in dense conspiracy theories and myth-making, offers its reader a disturbingly pragmatic approach to the supernatural, one based not on blind theological faith or spiritual humility, but on cold, calculated, and mortally dangerous jurisprudence. According to persistent legends that have stirred the minds of esoteric seekers for centuries, the original manuscript of this sinister book, whose authorship apocryphal tradition boldly attributes to the biblical King Solomon himself, is currently hidden away in the deepest and most impenetrable vaults of the Vatican, where, as the myth insists, the cursed text cannot physically burn even in the fiercest fire. Unlike many other magical journals that describe spiritual realms in vague and metaphorical terms, the Grand Grimoire presents a meticulous, step-by-step, crystal-clear set of instructions for summoning Lucifuge Rofocal, a powerful entity referred to as the Prime Minister of Hell, with one single and highly specific objective: to compel the demonic hierarch to sign an official, legally binding contract. The pages of this manuscript, covered in intricate occult seals, detail the creation of the so-called blasting rod, and most astonishingly, offer the bold practitioner clever loopholes in the agreement that theoretically allow an ambitious conjurer to obtain limitless earthly wealth and absolute power while avoiding the standard fatal price and preserving his immortal soul intact. although academic historians tend to classify the work with mild condescension as a brilliant, if macabre, example of 18th century European literature masquerading as ancient wisdom, the Grand Grimoire continues to lead a disturbingly active and influential existence in modern reality. Translated into French and carried across the Atlantic centuries ago, the text became something of a handbook within certain closed branches of Haitian Vodou and contemporary black magic practices, vividly demonstrating one deeply unsettling fact. While university scholars dissect the book purely as a cultural curiosity, at this very moment, in hundreds of dimly lit rooms around the world, desperate individuals are meticulously drawing these ancient symbols on the floor, sincerely hoping that someone from the other side of the invisible line will finally appear to place a signature. The Ripley Scroll, a 6-meter recipe for immortality. If you naively believe that cryptography belongs exclusively to modern intelligence agencies or brilliant mathematicians working with endless streams of binary code, then you should take a look at an object whose age exceeds 5 centuries and whose physical scale challenges the very concept of a book. In the dim archives of the British Library and several other restricted repositories around the world lies the so-called Ripley Scroll, a colossal manuscript nearly 20 feet long that cannot simply be read because its true meaning is encoded not in a conventional alphabet, but in disturbingly surreal, genuinely insane illustrations. This monumental parchment, attributed by historians to the famous 15th century English alchemist Sir George Ripley, is nothing less than a step-by-step, extraordinarily detailed instruction manual for creating the Philosopher's Stone, the mystical substance that, according to ancient treatises, could not only transmute cheap lead into pure gold, but also grant absolute and unshakable physical immortality. Fully aware of the catastrophic power that could fall into the hands of greedy fools if they gained direct access to the greatest secret of existence, Ripley, like many masters of his time, employed an extraordinarily sophisticated form of encoding, transforming complex chemical formulas into a grotesque visual labyrinth. Instead of dry ratios and dull reagent names, the endless unfolding scroll presents a true phantasmagoria before the stunned viewer. A giant bleeding toad dragon devouring its own tail, the so-called Bird of Hermes furiously tearing out its own feathers, and a naked king and queen slowly dissolving in a basin filled with bubbling acid. To a medieval inquisitor, or to a modern casual observer, this scroll appears to be a graphic manifestation of severe mental illness or a meticulous record of narcotic hallucination. Yet to initiated scholars of the past, every detail of this visual nightmare represented a precise, mathematically calibrated chemical instruction. The red blood of the mythical dragon could signify mercury sulfide, the toad symbolized sulfur, and the dissolving monarchs described the complex process of amalgamating noble metals, requiring perfect temperature control, likely indicated by the number of feathers on the illustrated bird's wings. And although today we possess powerful electron microscopes and spectral analyzers capable of dissecting the chemical composition of Ripley's ink down to its smallest atoms, we still stand helpless before this 6-meter riddle, confronted with a chilling and bitter truth. In our hands lies a detailed recipe for eternal life, yet we have forever lost the key to the universal symbolic language in which it was written. The Dresden Codex, an astronomical supercomputer made of bark. In the 16th century, when Spanish conquistadors, driven by fanatical and ruthless faith, landed on the shores of Mesoamerica, they methodically consigned thousands of priceless Maya manuscripts to the flames, forever destroying a vast portion of human history and turning monumental astronomical discoveries into gray ash scattered by the wind. Yet one extraordinary artifact miraculously escaped that inquisitorial fire, and, after an unimaginable journey across the ocean, survived to the present day. It is now preserved in Germany and bears the dry academic title Dresden Codex, the oldest, best preserved, and without question the most disturbingly precise book of pre-Columbian America. This manuscript, made from soaked fig tree bark and folded into a nearly 13-foot-long, 39-page accordion may at first glance appear to modern eyes as nothing more than a primitive collection of religious images where grotesque rain deities stand beside chilling figures of death gods. But beneath this colorful and deceptively archaic mythological surface lies nothing less than a powerful astronomical supercomputer of antiquity, whose algorithms leave contemporary scholars in astonishment. With astonishing, almost unsettling mathematical precision, Maya priests, without optical telescopes or advanced navigational instruments, encoded the movement of the planet Venus within these fragile pages, calculating its synodic period with an error margin of only 0.002 of a day, and compiled highly accurate tables of lunar and solar eclipses stretching centuries into the future. It was this codex, or rather, a fatal and widespread misinterpretation of its complex chronological cycles by modern pseudoscientists, that became the primary catalyst for the global hysteria of 2012, when millions around the world seriously prepared for an imminent apocalypse, mistakenly believing that the ancient text predicted the physical destruction of our planet. The bitter irony is that the Dresden Codex, stripped of Hollywood cliches and understood in its true context, contains no concept of a linear doomsday at all. Instead, it portrays the universe as an endless, continuously rotating mechanism where the death of one era is merely the mathematically inevitable starting point for the birth of the next. Today, our most advanced supercomputers can confirm the flawless accuracy of the Maya calculations down to the second. Yet we must acknowledge our intellectual helplessness. We have learned to read the dry numbers and dates inscribed on fig bark, but the true philosophical code of this manuscript, whose keys were mercilessly burned 5 centuries ago, remains an unsolvable enigma, silently taunting us from pages that survived the extinction of their own creators. The Smithfield, Decretals, a surreal nightmare in the margins of law. When we think of medieval art and monastic archives, our minds automatically conjure strict, canonical images of flawless saints and humble martyrs. Yet the manuscript known in academic circles as the Smithfield Decretals effortlessly shatters this pious stereotype, transforming what should have been a dry legal document into a full-blown psychedelic thriller. This monumental manuscript, a foundational compilation of canon law issued by decree of Pope Gregory IX in the 14th century, might have remained buried in archives as a monument to tedious bureaucratic thought, were it not for the astonishing, borderline unhinged work of anonymous illustrators who, over many years, meticulously filled the wide margins of this sacred volume with so-called marginalia. Instead of expected angels or solemn biblical scenes, the pages of this rigid ecclesiastical code reveal a grotesque, absurdist universe in which giant, bloodthirsty rabbits wielding axes mercilessly execute shackled hunters. Heavily armored knights engage in mortal combat with enormous horned snails, and amid tangled vegetal ornamentation suddenly appears a green, long-eared creature in a monk's robe, whose appearance bears an unsettling, near-perfect visual resemblance to Master Yoda from a famous space saga created almost 7 centuries later. Modern historians, armed with the latest tools of psychoanalysis and cultural theory, continue to argue fiercely about what compelled obedient monks, bound by vows of strict discipline before God, to embed this aggressive, surreal nightmare within the official text governing the spiritual and legal life of Catholic Europe. Was it a sophisticated form of hidden social protest against the overwhelming authority of the Church, a secret visual cipher of heretical alchemists, intelligible only to a select few, or perhaps an early form of medieval memes, through which scribes, slowly losing their sanity from years of punishing monotony and cold scriptoria, attempted to preserve what little remained of their mental stability? As we study these masterfully rendered yet disturbing miniatures, we cannot help but shudder at the realization that beneath the heavy, official layer of religious dogma, there always lurked a darker, uncontrollable underside of the human subconscious, one that mocked rules and laws alike, proving that throughout history, the human psyche has sought an escape beyond permitted boundaries, even if doing so required defiling a sacred book with monsters that would impress any modern horror filmmaker. Rongorongo, the murdered voice of Easter Island. When we turn our inquisitive gaze toward the most isolated patch of land on our planet, Easter Island, lost in the vast and unforgiving waters of the Pacific Ocean, our imagination immediately conjures colossal stone statues staring into empty eternity. Yet in the shadow of those monolithic giants lies an artifact far more modest in physical size, whose academic significance and impenetrable mystery vastly surpass the puzzle of transporting multi-ton stone blocks. In the 19th century, when the first European missionaries set foot on this God-forsaken and largely forgotten island, they discovered with astonishment dozens of strange wooden tablets inside the huts of the local inhabitants, densely covered with finely carved rows of miniature symbols that would later receive the melodic but utterly incomprehensible name Rongorongo. Examining these so-called talking boards, thickly engraved with intricate figures of humans, exotic birds, abstract astronomical signs, and unknown animals arranged in strict geometric patterns, modern linguists confront a staggering fact that challenges the very foundations of anthropology. Before them stands the only known original writing system in the entire history of Oceania to have emerged in complete cultural isolation from the rest of humanity. Although the independent invention of writing is one of the rarest and greatest triumphs of human intellect, an achievement that has occurred only a handful of times in world history, the key to deciphering this unique Pacific code was destroyed not by merciless time, nor by tsunamis or volcanic eruptions, but by something far more banal and grotesque: human greed. In 1862, an armed fleet of Peruvian slave traders landed on the shores of Rapa Nui and, through a series of brutal raids, captured or killed nearly the entire intellectual elite of the island, including high chiefs and the initiated priest Ariki, who were the sole custodians of the sacred knowledge required to make these wooden tablets speak. The few elders who miraculously escaped forced labor in the deadly Peruvian guano mines were soon wiped out by smallpox and tuberculosis introduced by Europeans, permanently severing the centuries-old chain of knowledge transmission and transforming priceless chronicles into mute museum relics. Today, with only 24 authentic Rongorongo tablets remaining on Earth, carefully scattered across the most secure museum vaults in the world, and with the most advanced neural networks and machine learning algorithms enlisted to study them, we remain completely blind and helpless. We stare at these flawlessly carved glyphs and cannot say with certainty what lies before our eyes. Perhaps they record a mundane list of harvested sweet potatoes. Perhaps they contain a grand epic of cosmic creation and star navigation charts of forgotten voyagers. Or perhaps they document encounters with unknown entities. The harsh reality is that this knowledge has been permanently erased from the cache of human civilization, leaving us only with the mockingly silent symbols of a world that has vanished forever. The Black Book of Carmarthen, Ultraviolet Ghosts of King Arthur. When we immerse ourselves in the mist-shrouded and archaically enchanted world of Celtic folklore, our imagination inevitably turns to the grand legends of the Knights of the Round Table. Yet the tangible epicenter of this mythological legacy is an artifact whose modest, almost unremarkable appearance stands in stark contrast to its immense historical and mystical significance. Within the heavily guarded walls of the National Library of Wales rests the so-called Black Book of Carmarthen, a small, time-worn manuscript created in the mid-13th century by a single monk scribe, officially recognized by scholars as the oldest surviving manuscript written entirely in the Welsh language. For centuries, academic researchers have turned its fragile parchment pages with reverent awe, for it is here, amid dense and intricate poetic stanzas, that we find some of the earliest, unembellished references to the legendary King Arthur and the great enchanter Merlin, who in this ancient tradition appears not as a benevolent fairy tale wizard, but as a traumatized, mad prophet wandering through wild forests. Yet the true, unsettling sensation that transformed this classical literary monument into a forensic detective story erupted only recently, when library curators, armed with modern spectral imaging and ultraviolet scanning technologies, decided to look beyond the visible spectrum and illuminated the ancient pages with invisible rays. Under the harsh glow of ultraviolet light, ghostly forms seemed to rise from centuries of oblivion as crude human faces with hollow eye sockets and entire stanzas of previously unknown poems began to emerge from what had appeared to be blank margins, texts that someone had methodically and mercilessly attempted to erase from existence. Careful forensic analysis revealed that in the 16th century, during a time of violent religious upheaval, an unknown censor armed with pumice and a sharp scraper had devoted extraordinary effort to scraping away the upper layer of parchment, desperately trying to obliterate specific passages closely tied to early, darker, and more pagan versions of the Arthurian cycle. As we gaze upon these spectral lines, glowing in laboratory half-light, we cannot help but ask a chilling question. What forbidden truths, unsettling prophecies, or unwelcome historical realities about Merlin's origins and the nature of ancient magic was this medieval editor so determined to conceal? This small black book reminds us of a disturbing truth. History consists not only of what was carefully preserved and handed down, but also of what someone powerful and frightened tried to force us to forget, leaving behind scraped voids that, 5 centuries later, began to speak again through a light invisible to the human eye. The Gospel of Judas, a papyrus that redefines good and evil. When we reflect on the foundational pillars upon which Western theological thought has rested for millennia, we inevitably confront the textbook, unquestionable image of absolute archetypal betrayal. Yet the manuscript known to modern scholarship as the Gospel of Judas overturns this moral paradigm with unsettling force, transforming history's greatest villain into its most tragic hero. This fragile Coptic papyrus, accidentally discovered in the 1970s in a dusty limestone cave in the Egyptian desert by greedy tomb raiders, endured a long and destructive journey through the global black market of antiquities before finally reaching professional restorers. By the time it did, the priceless text, having spent 16 years in a damp bank vault, had literally disintegrated into dust, reduced to 1 million brittle, decaying fragments. To save this Gnostic masterpiece from total physical destruction, leading experts in ancient texts spent years painstakingly assembling this microscopic, maddening puzzle between thin sheets of glass, carefully fitting together tiny scraps until lines began to emerge, lines that the early church fathers had known about as early as the 2nd century AD, but had fiercely, and they believed, successfully attempted to erase from human memory by branding them the gravest heresy. When the painstaking work of deciphering this apocryphal text was finally completed, historians experienced a profound existential shock. The restored passages declared that Judas Iscariot was not a greedy traitor who sold his teacher for 30 pieces of silver, but rather the closest, most enlightened, and the only apostle who truly understood the divine nature of Christ. According to this astonishing document, Jesus, openly mocking the spiritual blindness of the other disciples, personally took Judas aside and asked him to carry out the act of betrayal in order to help the divine spirit break free from the confines of mortal flesh, thereby placing upon his most trusted companion the heaviest burden in cosmic history. As we study these miraculously preserved fragments of papyrus, we feel a chilling realization. Judas understood that he would be eternally condemned by generations to come. Yet he consciously accepted this unimaginable sacrifice to fulfill a greater design, proving that the boundary between absolute evil and supreme self-sacrifice can be so thin that an entire civilization required 2,000 years simply to glimpse the story from another perspective. This crumbling text, long believed by Orthodox authorities to have been destroyed forever, serves as a fitting conclusion to our journey through the archives of the impossible, silently reminding us that even the most unshakable truths upon which empires and religions are built can collapse under the weight of a few surviving ancient pages. We have just touched texts that refuse to obey the laws of logic, morality, and time. Yet the most unsettling thought is that in the deep vaults of private collectors and sealed national archives, thousands of undeciphered pages still lie waiting for their moment to shatter our familiar world once again. Write in the comments which of these manuscripts you would never dare to open, even for $1 million. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because in the next video, we will descend even deeper. And remember, history is merely the version told by those who managed to burn the other books.